Hi Reddit. I never thought I'd post here, but I don't know where else to turn. I'm a 22-year-old guy named Nathan, and my dad, Jim, recently remarried. His new wife, Jessica, is only 29. It's been a weird adjustment, to say the least. My dad's always been a difficult man, hardworking but quick to anger. After my mom died 5 years ago, he buried himself in work. We drifted apart. He didn't approve of my college major or my laid-back attitude toward life. And now that he's remarried, I've been feeling more like a third wheel than ever. Jessica's the polar opposite of my dad. Bubbly, always smiling, and way too interested in my life. At first, I chalked it up to her trying to build a connection with me. But then, some of her comments started to feel off. It began subtly. When I visited them for dinner a month ago, Jessica complimented my new haircut. That seemed normal until she followed it up with, "You're really starting to look like a man now." Okay, weird, but I shrugged it off. Then she started laughing and said, "I bet the girls can't keep their hands off you." Her tone wasn't maternal or even sisterly, it felt flirty. I laughed awkwardly and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Dad didn't seem to notice. He was too busy scrolling on his phone. Things escalated 2 weeks later. I was staying at their house for the weekend. Jessica and I were alone in the kitchen when she touched my arm and said, "You've got strong hands, just like your dad." She held her hand there a beat too long before letting go. My stomach churned, but again I said nothing. Dad came in moments later, grumbling about work, oblivious to what had just happened. Am I overreacting? I keep questioning myself. Jessica's young, but she's still my dad's wife. Should I say something to him? Or am I just misreading her? I don't know what to do. The real breaking point came last weekend. Dad was out of town for a conference, and Jessica insisted I come over for dinner. "I hate eating alone," she said with a laugh. I thought maybe she was just lonely, so I agreed. When I arrived, the lights were dimmed, and she was wearing a dress I'd never seen before. Tight, low-cut, not the kind of thing you'd expect for a casual meal at home. I tried not to stare, but she caught me looking and smirked. "You like it?" she asked, twirling slightly. "I bought it for special occasions." Dinner was uneventful until dessert. She brought out a small cake and said, "I made this just for you. You deserve something sweet." The way she said it made my skin crawl. When I tried to excuse myself early, she placed her hand on my chest and said, "Don't rush off. It's nice having you here." I felt trapped. Every instinct told me to leave, but I didn't want to overreact. I stayed for another half hour, enduring more subtle comments and touches that felt anything but innocent. When I finally left, I barely made it to my car before I started shaking. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. The next day, I called my dad. I started slow, mentioning that Jessica seemed overly friendly. His response was dismissive. "She's just trying to make you feel welcome. You've always been too sensitive." "No, Dad," I said firmly. "It's more than that. She's making me uncomfortable." That's when he snapped. "Nathan, do you have any idea how much she's done for me? For us? She's been nothing but kind to you, and now you're accusing her of what, exactly? Being nice? Grow up." I hung up the phone, feeling angrier and more isolated than ever. It wasn't just his refusal to listen. It was the way he defended her, as if I were the intruder in his perfect little life. For the first time, I wondered if there was a part of him that didn't want to hear the truth. After my dad's dismissal, I started noticing more unsettling patterns. Jessica texted me frequently, things like, "Just checking in," or, "Hope you're doing okay," smiling face with smiling. That wasn't weird on its own, but the messages came at odd times, like late at night. Sometimes she sent photos of random things. A sunset, her new nails, or even a selfie with a caption like, "Feeling cute today." I ignored most of it, but it weighed on me. Every interaction with her felt like navigating a minefield. When I visited again, she made an offhand comment that stuck with me. "You're so much easier to talk to than your dad. He never listens." It was a casual dig at him, but her tone made it feel deliberate, like she was trying to form an alliance between us. I kept my responses short, avoiding eye contact, but it was getting harder to play along. Then came the kicker. I found out she was lying to my dad. She told him I had invited myself over for dinner that night he was out of town. When he mentioned it casually, I froze. She'd spun the story to make it seem like I was the one pushing boundaries. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Jessica wasn't just inappropriate. She was manipulative. I decided to confront her directly. The next time I visited, I waited until Dad was busy in his office. As soon as Jessica and I were alone in the living room, I said, "We need to talk." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "What about?" "You know exactly what I mean," I said, my voice shaking. "You've been crossing the line, and I need it to stop." Her smile faltered for a moment, but then she leaned back, crossing her legs. "Nathan, you're imagining things. I'm just being friendly. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why." I couldn't believe her audacity. Friendly doesn't mean touching me or lying to Dad about what happened. Her expression hardened. "Careful, Nathan. Your dad wouldn't appreciate you trying to stir up trouble." The threat was subtle, but it was there. I stood my ground, saying, "I'm not the one causing trouble. If this keeps up, I'll have no choice but to tell him everything." She didn't respond, just stared at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. For the rest of the visit, she was perfectly polite, but the tension was unbearable. I left that night knowing one thing for sure. Jessica wasn't going to back down, and neither could I. After my confrontation with Jessica, I knew I couldn't keep handling this alone. My dad wouldn't listen, and Jessica wasn't going to stop. I needed proof, something undeniable that would force him to see the truth. I started small. I installed a voice recording app on my phone and kept it running whenever I was at their house. I felt dirty doing it, but what choice did I have? The first few visits yielded nothing, just harmless chatter. But during my next visit, she slipped. I was sitting on the couch, and she leaned in close, her hand brushing my knee. "You're such a good-looking guy, Nathan. You must have girls falling all over you." I stiffened. "Jessica, that's not appropriate." She smirked, her voice dropping lower. "Don't be so serious. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." I stared at her, my stomach twisting in knots. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I excused myself and spent the rest of the evening avoiding her. But as soon as I got home, I played back the recording. Her tone, her words, they were all there. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Armed with my recording, I decided to approach my dad again. This time, I was determined not to let him dismiss me. I waited until he was in a good mood, rare these days, and said, "Dad, I need you to listen to something." He sighed heavily, already annoyed. "Nathan, if this is about Jessica." "It is," I interrupted. "But I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Just listen." I hit play and watched his face as Jessica's voice filled the room. Her flirtatious tone was unmistakable, but instead of anger or concern, he looked irritated. When the recording ended, he shook his head. "That's it? Nathan, this is nothing. She's being friendly. You're blowing this out of proportion." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Dad, she's crossing boundaries. If you don't see that." He cut me off, his voice rising. "Enough. You've always had a problem with me being happy. First, you don't like how I run things, now you're accusing my wife of, what, seducing you? Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" I stared at him, stunned. "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need your protection," he snapped. "And if you keep this up, you won't be welcome here anymore." His words hit me like a brick wall. He wasn't just ignoring the problem, he was choosing her over me. I left the house that day feeling more alone than ever, but I wasn't ready to give up. Jessica was playing a dangerous game, and I had to find a way to end it. I needed help, but there was no one I trusted, until I thought of Sarah. Sarah was my dad's neighbor and a close friend of my late mom. She'd known my family for years and had always been kind to me, often asking how I was doing when we bumped into each other. I paid her a visit under the pretense of catching up, but as we talked, the truth spilled out. At first, she seemed shocked. "Jessica? Are you sure?" I nodded, showing her the recording. "I don't know what else to do. Dad won't listen to me, and I'm afraid she's going to twist things even further." Sarah sat back, processing everything. "You're right to be cautious. Your dad has blinders on when it comes to Jessica. But you're not crazy, Nathan. I've noticed things too." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "She's touchy, Sarah admitted. Too touchy. And the way she talks about you, it's not normal for a stepmother. I didn't want to believe it, but now I think you're onto something. Her validation was a relief, but it also made the situation feel more dire. What do? I asked. Sarah's eyes narrowed with determination. If your dad won't believe words, we'll give him something he can't ignore. With Sarah's help, I came up with a plan. The next time Jessica invited me over, I'd accept. But this time, Sarah would be nearby, ready to step in if needed. She even loaned me a small camera that I could hide on my shirt, ensuring we'd have video evidence. The opportunity came quickly. Jessica texted me, asking if I'd help her move some furniture while Dad was at work. I agreed, and Sarah promised to keep her phone on standby. When I arrived, Jessica was dressed in workout leggings and a tank top that left little to the imagination. She greeted me with a hug that lingered too long. Thanks for coming, Nathan. You're such a lifesaver. We started moving furniture, but Jessica kept finding excuses to touch me. A hand on my back, a brush of her arm. Then, as we were taking a break, she leaned against the counter and said, "You know, I feel closer to you than anyone else in this family." I stayed calm, playing along. "That's nice of you to say." She smiled, stepping closer. "It's true. You're so different from your dad. So much more sensitive." I felt the bile rising in my throat, but I didn't move. Jessica reached out, trailing her fingers along my arm. "You deserve someone who really appreciates you." Before she could go any further, there was a loud knock at the door. Jessica jumped back, startled. Who could that be? I opened the door to find Sarah, her expression firm. "I just stopped by to check in," she said pointedly. Jessica's face flushed as she mumbled something about needing to get back to work. Later, Sarah and I reviewed the footage. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to prove Jessica's intentions. Now I just had to figure out how to use it without blowing up my entire family. Armed with the recording, I wrestled with how to present it to my dad. Every scenario I imagined ended with him brushing me off or, worse, blaming me for the entire situation. But Sarah was confident. "He can't deny this, Nathan. He might not want to face it, but once he sees the footage, he'll have no choice." I wasn't so sure. My dad's loyalty to Jessica was blinding, and every attempt to warn him had only driven a wedge deeper between us. Still, I couldn't let this go on. Jessica was manipulating him, and me, and it had to stop. I decided to confront him during one of his rare days off. When I showed up at the house, Jessica was conveniently absent, having left for yoga class. Dad was in the garage, tinkering with his tools, his usual scowl etched on his face. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. He barely looked up. "Got a minute to talk?" "If this is about Jessica, save it," he muttered. "I'm not in the mood for your accusations." "It's not an accusation," I said, pulling out my phone. "It's proof." I hit play on the video, holding my breath as Jessica's flirtatious comments filled the air. Her touch on my arm, her words about feeling closer to me than anyone else. It was all there, clear as day. My dad's expression shifted from irritation to something harder to read. He snatched the phone out of my hand, watching the footage again in silence. When it ended, he shoved the phone back at me. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice strained. "She was just being friendly." I stared at him, stunned. "Friendly? Dad, she's practically throwing herself at me. How can you not see that?" "Because I know her," he snapped. "She loves me, Nathan. She's not whatever you're trying to make her out to be." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're just going to ignore this? Pretend it's nothing?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Because it is nothing. You're overreacting, just like always." My heart sank. I realized then that it wasn't just Jessica's manipulation keeping him blind. It was his own stubbornness, his refusal to admit he might be wrong. I left the garage without another word, my anger and disappointment threatening to choke me. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "How did it go?" I typed back, "He's still in denial. I don't know what else to do." Her reply came quickly. "Then we'll just have to make him see. One way or another." I spent the next few days in a haze, unsure of what to do next. I'd shown my dad the proof, and he still refused to see it. Jessica had him wrapped around her finger, and every attempt I made to warn him only seemed to drive him further into her corner. Sarah, however, wasn't ready to give up. "He's not going to listen to you in private," she said over coffee one afternoon. "You need to put him in a situation where he can't deny the truth, where other people will see it too." Her words stuck with me. My dad wasn't the type to admit fault, but he also cared deeply about appearances. If his friends or colleagues saw the kind of behavior Jessica was engaging in, maybe, just maybe, it would force him to confront reality. The perfect opportunity came sooner than I expected. My dad was hosting a small gathering for his work friends, a backyard barbecue Jessica had insisted on throwing to show off their perfect life together. Sarah suggested I attend, and though I hesitated, I knew she was right. If I could catch Jessica slipping in front of witnesses, it might be enough to finally break through to my dad. When the day arrived, I felt a mix of dread and determination as I walked into their backyard. Jessica greeted me with her usual overly warm smile, her hand lingering on my arm a little too long. "So glad you could make it, Nathan," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "Your dad's been looking forward to this all week." "Has he?" I said flatly, my eyes scanning the crowd for Sarah, who had offered to come as backup. She was mingling near the grill, keeping an unobtrusive watch. As the afternoon wore on, Jessica's behavior became bolder. She found every excuse to touch me, fixing my collar, brushing non-existent lint off my sleeve, even leaning in close to whisper jokes in my ear. Each time, I glanced at my dad, but he seemed oblivious, too busy entertaining his guests to notice. Finally, as the sun began to set, Jessica pulled me aside, away from the crowd. "Nathan," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I need your help with something inside." Alarm bells went off in my head, but I forced a neutral expression. "Sure," I said, following her into the house. Sarah caught my eye as I passed, and I gave her a subtle nod. Inside, Jessica led me to the kitchen, closing the door behind us. "It's so exhausting being out there," she said, leaning against the counter. "Sometimes I feel like you're the only one who really understands me." I took a step back, my pulse racing. "Jessica, I don't think." Before I could finish, she stepped closer, her hand brushing against my chest. "You don't have to think," she murmured. "You just have to feel." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But then, the sound of a camera shutter cut through the tension. We both turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her phone raised. "What the hell are you doing?" Jessica demanded, her face pale. "Just capturing the moment," Sarah said calmly. She turned to me. "Let's go, Nathan." Jessica's expression twisted into a mix of rage and panic. "You can't show him that. He'll never believe you." "That's not for you to decide," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. As Sarah and I left the house, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out now, and no matter how much Jessica tried to spin it, she couldn't erase what had just happened. The following day, I waited for my dad's call. I knew Sarah had already sent him the photo, along with a short but damning explanation of what had happened. She wasn't one to beat around the bush, and her message left no room for Jessica's excuses. Still, I couldn't shake the nervous knot in my stomach. Would he finally see the truth, or would he find some way to blame me again? By evening, my phone buzzed. It was him. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, Dad. What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was sharp, laced with anger. My heart sank. "Dad, don't even start," he snapped. "Jessica told me everything. She said you've been trying to drive a wedge between us for weeks, and now you're dragging Sarah into it? Taking pictures to make her look bad? What's wrong with you?" "She's lying," I said, my voice rising in frustration. "Did you even look at the photo? She's the one crossing boundaries, not me." "I don't need to look at anything," he said. "I know my wife, Nathan. She's not perfect, but she loves me. Whatever you're trying to pull here, it's pathetic." My chest tightened as his words sank in. He wasn't just refusing to see the truth. He was doubling down on his denial. "You're choosing her over me," I said quietly. "Again." "I'm choosing my wife," he said coldly. "And if you can't respect that, maybe it's best if you stay away for a while." I hung up, my hands trembling. It was over. No matter what proof I had, no matter how much Jessica's actions hurt me, or him, he wasn't willing to listen. She had him completely under her control, and there was nothing I could do to change that. As I sat in my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head, a text from Sarah came through. How did it go? He didn't believe me, I replied. He thinks I'm the problem. Her response was immediate. I'm sorry, Nathan, but don't give up. The truth has a way of coming out, even if it takes time. I wanted to believe her, but I wasn't sure I could. For now, all I could do was step back and let things play out. Maybe she was right. Maybe one day my dad would finally see Jessica for who she really was. Until then, I'd have to protect myself. From her and from the pain of my dad's betrayal. Weeks passed with no word from my dad. I stayed away, just as he'd demanded, and focused on putting the pieces of my life back together. But the silence weighed on me. Despite everything, I still wanted him to see the truth. Not for me, but for himself. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from Sarah. Nathan, she said, her voice tense. You're not going to believe this. Your dad called me. What? Why? He asked to see the photo again, she said. I think something's changed. It turned out Jessica had slipped up. One of my dad's coworkers, someone who'd been at the barbecue, mentioned seeing Jessica act a little too friendly toward me. When my dad confronted her about it, she deflected, accusing me of being the instigator. But the coworker's comment planted a seed of doubt. For the first time, my dad was forced to consider that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't lying. 2 days later, I got a text from my dad. We need to talk. Can you come by the house? When I arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, and my dad looked like he hadn't slept in days. He gestured for me to sit, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the weight of everything hanging in the air. I looked at the photo, he finally said. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. And I talked to Sarah. I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. She admitted. She crossed a line, he said, his face hardening. But she says it was harmless. That you're exaggerating. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling to the surface. Dad, it wasn't harmless. She's been playing you, and me, for months. His jaw tightened. I don't know what to believe anymore. I want to think she's telling the truth. But, you're my son. His voice broke slightly. I don't want to lose you. It wasn't the apology I'd hoped for, but it was a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. I don't want to lose you either, I said. But if you keep ignoring what she's doing, that's exactly what will happen. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. I need time to figure this out. In the weeks that followed, my dad began to pull back from Jessica. He didn't say it outright, but I could see the cracks in their relationship. Sarah kept me updated, saying Jessica was increasingly agitated, lashing out in small ways as she realized she was losing control. Eventually, my dad filed for divorce. He didn't give me many details, but I didn't need them. What mattered was that he was finally free, and so was I. We're still rebuilding our relationship. It's not perfect, and it might never be. But for the first time in years, I feel like my dad is really seeing me. And as for Jessica, she's out of our lives for good. I still think about everything that happened, the damage she caused, and the trust that was shattered. But I've learned something important. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. And when it does, it can set you free.